The film opens in a quiet basement where a security guard is making his routine rounds. As he inspects the area, he comes across a man posing as a repair technician, claiming he's there to fix some wiring. The guard quickly grows suspicious and questions why he hasn't seen any official paperwork. When he asks for proof of authorization, the situation takes a brutal turn. The supposed repairman suddenly attacks and fatally stabs him. Cut to a corporate office where a meeting has just wrapped up. Employees casually step into an elevator, unaware of the danger about to unfold. Elsewhere in the building, an unseen individual presses a control, and without warning, the cables supporting the elevator snap. The lift begins to drop violently. Emergency responders rush to the scene. Lieutenant Mack gathers his team and reveals the grim reality. 13 people are trapped in an elevator hanging somewhere below the 30th floor. Then comes the demand. A mysterious bomber insists on being paid $3.7 million, threatening to disable the emergency braking system if his conditions aren't met. The clock is ticking with just 23 minutes to act. The building's internal structure limits access, forcing officers to use maintenance panels. Worse still, the elevator hatch has been rigged to detonate if tampered with. Officer Jack and Detective Harry step forward, volunteering to handle the situation. They quickly make their way to the nearest access point on the 32nd floor and climb into the shaft, eventually positioning themselves above the compromised elevator. Inside the lift, panic begins to set in among the trapped passengers. Jack and Harry call down to them, identifying themselves as lapped and reassuring them that it's merely a technical issue. Unbeknownst to them, the bomber, Howard, is secretly listening in on every word. As they prepare their next move, Harry throws Jack a hypothetical question. What would he do if a gunman was using a hostage as a shield while trying to board a plane? Jack's answer is cold but calculated. He'd shoot the hostage to stop a greater catastrophe. Harry is stunned, questioning Jack's mindset. Determined to remove Howard's leverage, Jack comes up with a risky plan to extract the passengers. He secures himself with a cable, lowers himself upside down, and attaches a hook to the elevator. But Howard catches on. Without hesitation, he disables the emergency brakes. The elevator suddenly drops, sending everyone inside into chaos. The hook, connected to a crane, strains under immense pressure before giving way, causing the lift to plunge further before jamming again. Jack quickly drills through the access panel and reaches out to the terrified passengers, pulling them to safety one by one. Among them is a particularly frightened woman, but with effort and reassurance, she too is rescued. During the ordeal, Jack realizes something crucial. The bomber isn't operating remotely. He's somewhere inside the building. The team deduces that Howard is hiding within the freight elevator system and attempts to track him down. However, as they close in, Howard ambushes them, opening fire. Jack and Harry find themselves trapped as Howard gains the upper hand, holding Harry hostage and taunting Jack. As the situation spirals, Jack makes a desperate call. He shoots Harry in the leg, creating an opportunity to disrupt Howard's control. In response, Howard detonates explosives, causing massive destruction. Despite the chaos, both Jack and Harry survive. Later, they are honored in a formal ceremony, receiving medals for their courage and for saving all 13 passengers. It's believed that Howard perished in the explosion and the case appears closed, but the truth is far more unsettling. Somewhere else, Howard is alive, watching the ceremony unfold on television. He slowly claps, amused by the recognition given to the officers who nearly stopped him. Life seems to return to normal. The officers celebrate, acknowledging how narrowly they escaped death. Eventually, Harry heads home to recover. In Santa Monica, Jack grabs coffee and muffins, chatting briefly with a friend who works as a bus driver. Moments later, as Jack prepares to leave, something shocking happens. The bus suddenly explodes without warning. Stunned, Jack runs toward the wreckage, trying to make sense of it. Nearby, a payphone begins to ring. Jack answers, and on the other end is Howard. Calm and calculating, Howard reveals that he spent 2 years planning the elevator attack, only for it to fail. But he's far from done. His dedication, he claims, is unmatched. Blowing up the bus was simply a way to get Jack's attention. He still wants his $3.7 million. Then Howard presents a new deadly scenario. What if a bus were rigged with a bomb that activates once it reaches 50 miles per hour and detonates if it slows below that speed? Jack immediately asks for the bus's identity, but Howard insists he follow instructions. He provides the location and lays out strict rules. No one gets off the bus, and the money must be delivered by 11 a.m. or the bomb will explode. Meanwhile, a woman named Annie boards a city bus heading downtown from Venice, completely unaware of the danger she's stepping into. Jack races through traffic, pushing his car to the limit as he chases down the bus. Inside, the passengers remain calm, more concerned about delays than anything else, as traffic forces the driver to slow down. Determined to stop disaster, Jack abandons his car and sprints toward the moving bus, trying to warn the driver. He shouts that he's lapped, but no one takes him seriously. With no other choice, he commandeers a nearby vehicle and resumes the pursuit. As the bus accelerates past 50 miles per hour, the bomb silently activates. Jack finally pulls alongside and shouts to the driver, urgently revealing the truth. There's a bomb on board, and under no circumstances can the bus drop below 50 miles per hour. Jack quickly reaches out to Harry and delivers the shocking update: the bomber survived. There's no time to process it. He pulls himself onto the speeding bus and tries to warn everyone on board about what they're dealing with. But panic sparks instantly. One of the passengers pulls out a gun, pointing it straight at Jack. In response, Jack instinctively draws his weapon too. The tension spikes for a moment, but he manages to de-escalate, lowering his gun and urging everyone to stay calm. As things begin to settle, another passenger, Ortiz, attempts to disarm the armed man. In the struggle, the gun accidentally goes off and the driver is hit. He's badly injured, losing control of the bus. With no time to waste, Jack finally reveals the truth: there's a bomb on board. Annie, one of the passengers, steps up without hesitation and takes over the wheel. Outside, law enforcement mobilizes rapidly, dispatching helicopters to track and assist. Watching all of this unfold from a distance, Howard sits comfortably, glued to the television, clearly enjoying every second. Over the phone, Jack and Harry exchange critical details about the device. The bomb is loaded with a massive amount of C-4, equipped with multiple triggers, and connected to a timer hidden inside a gold wristwatch. The rules are clear: keep the bus above 50 miles per hour or everyone dies. The ride becomes increasingly chaotic. The bus barrels through obstacles, barely staying on course as Annie struggles to maintain control. Meanwhile, Howard casually flips between news coverage and a football game, treating the entire situation like entertainment. Back at command, Harry begins analyzing the bomber's methods. He notices a pattern: each device is different, suggesting a deep level of expertise. This isn't someone improvising, this is someone highly trained. More importantly, the bomber seems to anticipate police tactics before they even happen. That realization pushes Harry toward a new lead. He orders his team to dig through records of former officers from the past decade. In the air, Mac coordinates the operation from a helicopter, guiding Jack through the safest possible route while ground units prepare for intervention. Inside the bus, Annie pushes herself to the limit, weaving through traffic at dangerous speeds just to keep everyone alive. At one point, they approach a sharp turn that could easily flip the bus at their current speed. With everyone bracing, Annie manages to steer through it, barely holding the vehicle steady. It's a close call, but they make it. Jack takes a moment to acknowledge Annie's courage, genuinely impressed by how she's handling the situation. She asks the question that's been haunting everyone: why them? Why this bus? Jack admits the truth: this isn't about the passengers. It's about him. The bomber is targeting Jack specifically, turning everything into a twisted game. And even if they survive today, there's no guarantee it ends here. Back at HQ, Harry continues connecting the dots. He suspects the bomber might be disabled, possibly injured in the past, and could even be a former officer. Acting on instinct, he orders a deep dive into pension records, convinced the answer is there. Meanwhile, police units attempt to find a way to extract passengers, but Jack shuts the idea down immediately. Any attempt to remove someone could be spotted, and Howard wouldn't hesitate to detonate the bomb. Mac raises a troubling possibility: the bomber might have once been one of their own. Suddenly, the phone rings again. Howard is back. Jack uses the opportunity to negotiate and manages to secure something crucial: the release of the wounded driver. It's a small victory, but it keeps hope alive. Then everything takes a darker turn. A passenger named Helen, overwhelmed by fear, decides she can't take it anymore. She makes a desperate attempt to jump off the bus while it's still moving. The moment she does, Howard triggers an explosion at the front of the bus. The blast throws her off violently and she disappears beneath the vehicle. The shock hits everyone hard. Panic spreads, arguments break out, and fear takes over. Annie is shaken, struggling to keep herself together. Jack checks on her, trying to ground her emotionally. She's torn between relief and guilt, blaming herself for what just happened. But Jack reassures her firmly: if Helen had gotten away, the bomber would have killed everyone else. As if things weren't bad enough, Mac delivers another piece of devastating news. Ahead of them lies an incomplete section of the freeway, a 50-foot gap with no road. For a moment, it seems impossible, but Jack makes a call. He decides they have no choice but to go for it. Since it's part of an interchange, there might be enough elevation to carry them across. He instructs everyone to brace themselves and keep their heads down. The bus speeds forward, hits the edge, and launches into the air. For a split second, everything goes silent. Then, against all odds, the bus lands safely on the other side. Relief floods the passengers. Some laugh, some cry, others just sit there in disbelief. It's a miracle they're still alive. Jack immediately redirects Annie toward the exit leading to the cargo area of Los Angeles International Airport. His reasoning is strategic. Once inside, the helicopters won't be able to follow closely, cutting off Howard's live updates. As they move, Howard calls again, demanding his money with growing impatience. He claims he's earned it. He reveals more about himself. He once received a medal, but it was followed by a dismissal and a hollow apology after an injury ruined his hand. Jack uses this moment to propose a risky move. He asks to step off the bus alone so he can personally handle the exchange with the authorities. After a tense pause, Howard agrees, but only if Jack returns quickly and doesn't try anything clever. Before leaving, Jack tells Annie to keep circling the runway, maintaining speed no matter what. Once off the bus, Jack reconnects with Mac. The idea of evacuating passengers comes up again, but Jack shuts it down. Howard has outmaneuvered them at every step. He won't miss this. There's only one option left. Jack decides he has to defuse the bomb himself. Back on the bus, confusion spreads among the passengers as they wonder what's happening outside. Over the radio, Mac warns Jack that they can't keep things stable forever. Jack, focused and determined, responds with one request: just a few more minutes. Harry stays on the line with Jack, guiding him step by step as a cable is secured around Jack's waist. Lying flat on a mechanic's creeper, Jack carefully lowers himself beneath the speeding bus. Sparks fly and metal rattles as he inches closer to the explosive device, relying entirely on Harry's voice for instructions. As he studies the setup, they quickly realize something alarming. The wiring forms a collapsible circuit, meaning any attempt to bypass it will instantly trigger the bomb. Back at headquarters, a breakthrough comes in. The bomber's identity is uncovered: Howard Payne, a former member of the Atlanta Police Department's bomb squad. He had been forced into retirement years earlier after an accident cost him part of his hand, leaving him with only 9 fingers. Convinced they've found their man, Harry and his team move out to track him down. Underneath the bus, Jack struggles to maintain his grip as the vehicle swerves violently. Ortiz, showing courage, volunteers to help from inside. Suddenly, the cable snaps. Jack nearly loses control, clinging desperately as the road rushes past beneath him. In the chaos, he accidentally punctures the fuel tank, sending gasoline spraying everywhere. Inside, Annie panics, fearing she may have run him over. For a terrifying moment, Jack is barely holding on. Then Ortiz manages to pry open a section of the bus floor, reaching down just in time to pull him back inside. Breathless but alive, Jack immediately warns Mac about the leaking fuel, urging him to send help before things get even worse. Meanwhile, Harry and his team storm Howard's house, but the place is rigged. The moment they step inside, a hidden explosive is triggered. The blast tears through the building, killing Harry instantly. Shortly after, Jack's phone rings. Hoping it's Harry, he answers, but it's Howard. Calm, almost amused, he informs Jack that his partner is dead. He even mocks the investigation, suggesting that the gold watch, his so-called retirement gift, was the clue that led them straight into his trap. Then he reminds Jack of the stakes: no money, no survivors. During the call, Howard casually refers to Annie as a wildcat. That single word catches Jack's attention. He glances at Annie's University of Arizona sweatshirt and pieces it together. Howard isn't just guessing. He can see inside the bus. There must be a hidden camera feeding him video, though without sound. Thinking fast, Jack quietly instructs everyone to act normal. No sudden reactions, no panic. They quickly record footage of the bus interior appearing calm and uneventful. Mac coordinates with the media, pulling live coverage off air and replacing it with the looped recording. For the moment, Howard is fooled. Taking advantage of the distraction, authorities carefully evacuate the passengers one by one without triggering the bomb. Soon, only Jack and Annie remain on board. They rig the accelerator to keep the bus moving, then use the open floor panel to slide themselves out safely. Moments later, the unmanned bus crashes straight into a cargo plane and erupts into a massive explosion. Fireballs and debris fill the air as the rescued passengers watch from a distance. Jack and Annie, though shaken, are alive. Relief washes over them as Mac arrives and medics rush in to check their injuries. But it isn't over. Howard calls again, demanding his money. It becomes clear he has no idea the bus has already exploded. Mac plays along, promising the payment within 30 minutes. Law enforcement quickly mobilizes, surrounding the designated drop location. Jack and Annie are placed in an ambulance, but Jack suddenly steps out, saying he'll return shortly. Meanwhile, the police prepare a clever trap, hiding a paint bomb inside the ransom money. disguised sanitation workers drop the cash into a trash can at the agreed spot. From a distance, Howard surveys the scene, spotting officers concealed in various positions. Sensing something isn't right, he tries to activate the bus bomb, only to realize he's been tricked by the fake broadcast. Without missing a beat, he shifts tactics. Disguising himself as a police officer, he infiltrates the area and abducts Annie. Back at the command center, confusion spreads as the money remains untouched. Jack knows something is wrong. Howard is never late. Then it hits him. He discovers an escape route beneath the trash can, realizing Howard has already collected the ransom and slipped away. Tracking him down leads Jack to an underground subway station, where he finds Annie strapped with explosives, surrounded by additional bombs. Howard appears, forcing Annie to fill a bag with the money under threat. Jack tries to negotiate, urging him to take the cash and release her. But Howard, cold and detached, reminds him that bombs exist for one purpose: to explode. He takes Annie with him and heads onto a subway train, firing his weapon to keep everyone at bay. Jack rushes in just in time, managing to board the train as it pulls away. Inside, Howard kills the driver, taking full control. As the train speeds forward, Howard continues to torment Annie, speaking casually about how the explosion won't hurt as much as she fears. Then he discovers the paint bomb hidden among the money. Furious, he realizes he's been deceived again. Jack confronts him, and the two engage in a brutal fight on top of the moving train. The struggle is intense, both men barely keeping their balance as the train races ahead. Suddenly, Howard is thrown forward, smashing into a railway signal. The impact sends him flying off the train, ending his rampage. But the danger isn't over yet. Mac radios Jack with urgent news. The track ahead is incomplete. The train can't stop in time. Inside, Annie is still handcuffed to a pole. Jack desperately tries to free her, but nothing works. With no other option, he decides to push forward, accelerating the train and bracing for impact. They hold on to each other tightly as the train hurtles toward the unfinished section. It derails violently, cars breaking apart as they crash through the barrier. Miraculously, the section carrying Jack and Annie flies off the track and lands on a nearby road outside the construction zone. Silence follows, then relief. They're alive. Overwhelmed with emotion, Jack and Annie embrace and kiss, surrounded by stunned onlookers who can't believe what they've just witnessed. What makes a film instantly compelling? It isn't the scale of its budget, the presence of major stars, or even the spectacle of large-scale destruction. It's the idea, the single, defining premise that captures your attention before the story has even begun. And Speed delivers one of the most striking high-concept ideas ever brought to screen. A city bus has been rigged with an explosive device. Once it crosses 50 miles per hour, it cannot slow down. If it does, the system activates. That's the entire foundation. No elaborate mythology, no dense exposition, just one rule and an entire narrative constructed around it. What makes this premise so effective is not only its simplicity, but its immediacy. It is inherently visual. You don't need to interpret it or analyze it to understand its stakes. You experience them instinctively. Every subtle dip of the speedometer introduces unease. Every turn, every obstacle, every moment of hesitation transforms into a potential point of failure. The threat is never concealed. It remains present, persistent, and unrelenting. This is the essence of high-concept filmmaking, an idea so clear and so immediate that it generates its own momentum. The film never has to persuade you why it matters. The stakes are already embedded within its design. Lives hang in the balance, governed by a rule that offers no margin for error. Because the premise is so tightly constructed, everything else aligns with precision. The action never feels arbitrary. It feels inevitable. The tension does not need to be manufactured. It is intrinsic to the situation. Even the most basic decisions, accelerating, braking, navigating, carry profound consequences. This is why the film resonates so strongly. At its core, it understands a principle many action films overlook. Intensity does not require complexity. It requires clarity. It requires urgency. And above all, it requires a concept that refuses to release its hold on the audience. The moment the bus reaches 50, the narrative commits fully, and from that point forward, it sustains an unbroken sense of forward motion. Before the film evolves into a relentless momentum-driven experience, it makes a deliberate and strategic choice. It establishes trust. Rather than immediately placing the audience on the bus, it begins within a confined, high-stakes environment, an elevator rigged with an explosive device, suspended high above the ground, with civilians trapped inside. The sequence is focused, controlled, and executed with remarkable efficiency. More importantly, it defines the rules of this world before expanding its scope. This is where we are introduced to Jack Traven and his partner Harry Temple, not through exposition, but through behavior. Their decision-making, their composure under pressure, and their ability to communicate in critical moments reveal everything necessary about their character. There is no reliance on background exposition or extended dialogue. Their competence becomes their introduction, and their actions define who they are. At the same time, the film introduces its central antagonist, Howard Payne. He is more than a conventional villain. He is a calculated presence, a voice that exerts control from a distance. When his initial plan is disrupted, when that control is challenged, the narrative introduces a crucial element, motivation. The conflict is no longer procedural, it becomes personal. This opening sequence serves a purpose beyond spectacle. Structurally, it functions as a foundation. It establishes tone, stakes, and the dynamic between protagonist and antagonist. It demonstrates how the system operates before expanding it to a far larger and more volatile scale. And when the elevator crisis concludes, there is a brief sense of resolution, as though the narrative could end there. But that is precisely the illusion. What unfolds in this opening is not the main event. It is a prelude. The larger threat is still approaching, and this time it will not be confined. It will move through an open environment, exposed and uncontrollable, and once it begins, it cannot be contained. Once the foundation is established, the film does not simply continue. It reconstructs itself on a broader and more precarious scale. What begins as a contained scenario expands into something far more unstable, a mobile threat unfolding within a public space, beyond the limits of control. This is where the structure becomes the film's most effective instrument. It is not merely telling a story, it is advancing a system of escalation. The progression is deliberate. First, the elevator, a confined environment with controlled variables, functioning as a test. Then, the bus. The parameters shift entirely. The threat is no longer contained. It is in motion, navigating through traffic, surrounded by civilians, exposed to the unpredictability of an entire city. The stakes do not simply rise, they multiply. From this point onward, the film adheres to a single guiding principle: sustained escalation. Each obstacle is introduced with intention. Traffic congestion, injured passengers, external interference, physical limitations. Every complication builds upon the last. There is no reset, no pause, no safe interval. Only continuous progression. The structure avoids fragmentation. It accumulates pressure. Every decision carries consequences forward. Every solution introduces a new variable. The narrative does not advance in isolated beats. It moves in continuous waves of intensifying tension. Even as it approaches its final act, the film resists resolution. Rather than concluding at the peak of the bus sequence, it extends further, introducing new environments and new layers of risk. For some, this may feel excessive. For others, it reflects the film's commitment to its central principle: escalation without compromise. This is what defines its identity. It is not solely about an explosive device or a single vehicle. It is about a narrative that understands a fundamental rule of tension. Once momentum begins, it must be sustained. It cannot decelerate. It can only intensify. If the premise functions as the hook and the structure serves as the engine, then the action becomes the sustaining force that keeps the entire system in motion. The film is not simply defined by its action, it is constructed through it. From the moment the bus surpasses its critical threshold, every sequence is designed with precision, operating under the constant awareness that a single misstep could result in catastrophic failure. What distinguishes these sequences is not just their scale, but their discipline. Each moment is built around constraints, rules that cannot be violated. The bus cannot decelerate. The passengers cannot simply escape. The environment offers no clear path forward. Every solution feels provisional, as though it could collapse at any moment. This is what gives the action its edge. It is not spectacle driven by randomness. It is carefully controlled, shaped by limitations. The film embraces physical execution with remarkable confidence. High-speed pursuit, near collisions, precise maneuvering through constrained spaces. Each sequence contributes to a continuous balance between control and collapse. The movement of the bus through dense traffic, the calculated efforts to relocate passengers, the constant negotiation between stability and failure, all of it reinforces the same underlying principle. And then there is the sequence that has become emblematic of the film's identity, the bus jump. A section of road disappears ahead, and deceleration is not an option. The only viable choice is forward momentum. The vehicle launches, crossing a gap that defies conventional logic. It is an exaggerated moment, yet within the context established by the film, it feels coherent. The audience has already accepted the central condition. Stopping is not survivable. Therefore, forward motion becomes the only possible response. This is where the design reveals its ingenuity. Every sequence reinforces the same directive: maintain movement regardless of the risk. As the narrative progresses, the scale expands, the environment evolves, and the complexity increases, yet the core principle remains intact. The film continues to develop without losing its focus. Underlying all of this is a strong sense of physical presence. The weight of the vehicles, the resistance of the road, the impact of each collision, these elements anchor the spectacle in something tangible. Even as the scenarios approach the limits of plausibility, the execution maintains a sense of grounded intensity. This is why the action continues to stand apart, not because it adheres strictly to realism, and not because it aims for subtlety, but because it is constructed with clarity, discipline, and an unwavering commitment to momentum. But it understands something essential. Effective action is not defined solely by what occurs, but by how close it feels to unraveling. That sense of proximity to failure is what gives each moment its edge. If there is one principle speed embraces without hesitation, it is movement. Not just physical movement, but narrative momentum. From the moment the central premise takes hold, the film refuses to decelerate. Scenes transition rapidly. Problems evolve in real time. The story does not pause for reflection. It advances with a continuous, almost relentless drive. This is what defines its pacing. It is not merely fast, it is sustained. Each time the narrative appears ready to ease, another complication emerges. A new obstacle, a new variable, a decision that must be made instantly. There are no extended pauses embedded within the structure, no moments of complete safety for either the characters or the audience. Instead, it creates a very specific sensation. You are not observing events unfold, you are being carried through them. This is where the film extends beyond conventional action storytelling. It becomes an experience of sustained tension, where attention never drifts because the narrative never allows it. Even the quieter intervals are not truly restful. They function more as brief suspensions moments that recalibrate just enough to initiate the next surge of intensity. The underlying pressure never disappears, it simply waits beneath the surface. However, this approach introduces a delicate trade-off. When a film maintains this level of momentum for such an extended duration, it risks crossing from intensity into fatigue. For some, that relentless pace is precisely what makes the experience so compelling, immersive, engaging, and continuously gripping. For others, it can become overwhelming, with too many high-stakes moments unfolding in rapid succession without contrast. And contrast is essential. Tension gains strength through release. Without variation, even the most compelling sequences can begin to feel familiar, then repetitive, and eventually diminished in impact. Yet the film makes a conscious choice. It prioritizes momentum over restraint, urgency over reflection. It keeps its narrative engine operating at maximum capacity. Whether that choice feels exhilarating or excessive, one truth remains. Once the film accelerates, it does not wait for you to catch up. This is where it begins to navigate a very narrow balance. The same momentum that initially elevates the experience can gradually begin to work against it. At first, the pacing is invigorating. Each new obstacle intensifies the stakes, each close call sharpens the tension. The pressure builds continuously, and the audience remains fully engaged. But over time, a subtle shift occurs. The escalation stops evolving and begins to echo itself. When every sequence carries the same level of urgency, the distinction between moments begins to blur. The unpredictability that once defined the experience starts to feel structured, even expected. It is a familiar challenge when abundance reduces impact. Without moments of stillness, without space to process, the narrative can risk overwhelming its own audience. For some viewers, this is the point where the film transitions from grounded tension into something more exaggerated, an escalating chain of increasingly ambitious scenarios where spectacle begins to take precedence over plausibility. And with that shift, emotional engagement can begin to soften. Because tension thrives on rhythm. It requires contrast, modulation, and variation. Without that balance, even the most elaborate sequences can start to merge together. This does not undermine the film's effectiveness. It simply reveals the boundaries of its approach. The commitment to uninterrupted momentum is both its defining strength and its inherent limitation. It becomes a paradox. The refusal to slow down occasionally diminishes the very impact that acceleration is meant to create. Then there is the aspect the film subtly encourages you not to examine too closely: the logic. The moment you step back and analyze the mechanics, the structure begins to show its strain. The premise itself already operates at the edge of plausibility, a vehicle that must maintain a precise speed through an urban environment to avoid triggering a catastrophic outcome. It is inventive, compelling, and just grounded enough to draw you in. But as the narrative progresses, it begins to extend beyond realism. A public transit vehicle navigating dense city traffic at sustained high velocity, a sequence of events aligning with remarkable precision to prevent failure. A carefully constructed plan that depends on exact timing, even under unpredictable conditions. And, of course, the defining sequence: the bus confronting a gap in the roadway with no option to decelerate, forced into forward motion despite the physical impossibility. It is a moment that challenges conventional physics, yet within the context of the film, it remains effective. Not because it is technically accurate, but because the narrative has already conditioned the audience to accept its internal logic. The central rule has been established: stopping is not survivable. Therefore, forward motion becomes the only viable response. This is the film's key strategy. It does not attempt to justify every detail. It does not pause to explain the mechanics behind each event. Instead, it moves with such confidence and velocity that it surpasses the viewer's impulse to question it. The focus shifts from analysis to anticipation. You are not asking whether it is possible. You are invested in what will happen next. Of course, when examined closely, the inconsistencies are evident. The plan relies on variables that are difficult to sustain. The decisions are not always entirely rational. The physical outcomes stretch credibility. In a more restrained narrative, these elements would stand out. But here, they are secondary. Because the film operates on a different principle, believability is driven by engagement, not precision. As long as the tension remains effective and the stakes feel immediate, the experience holds. The internal logic becomes less important than the forward momentum. This is the risk the film embraces. It acknowledges that not every element aligns perfectly, but it relies on the pace and intensity to carry the audience beyond those concerns. Given this relentless pace, one might expect the dialogue to function purely as a structural necessity, brief exchanges designed only to move the plot forward. Instead, the film approaches it with greater intention. The dialogue introduces rhythm. It cuts through the tension with clarity and energy. Characters do not simply respond to events. They interact dynamically, creating a sense of movement within the conversations themselves. Lines are delivered quickly, often under pressure, reinforcing the overall momentum of the film. At its most effective, the writing enhances the experience. It brings personality to the unfolding events, preventing the tension from becoming overly heavy. Moments of wit emerge within high-pressure situations. Character is revealed through reaction rather than extended exposition. Even a brief line or recurring phrase can anchor a sequence and give it identity. In this way, the dialogue becomes part of the pacing. It does not interrupt the flow, it moves alongside it. Yet this approach is not without its inconsistencies. Not every line carries the same weight. At times, the writing leans toward stylization over authenticity. Certain exchanges feel constructed for impact rather than arising naturally from the situation. In moments of extreme pressure, the dialogue occasionally adopts a level of composure that feels more aligned with cinematic convention than with human instinct. There is also a subtle tension in tone. The film transitions between humor and urgency, between lightness and intensity. While this contrast can be effective, it is not always seamlessly integrated. What feels sharp and precise in one moment can, in the next, lean towards something more exaggerated. The tone is not always perfectly consistent, but it is never lifeless, and that distinction matters. because even when the dialogue falters, it continues to serve a purpose. It sustains the film's identity. It maintains forward motion. It ensures the narrative never settles into a purely mechanical sequence of events. In a film driven by momentum, the dialogue has a singular responsibility. It must never impede that momentum. And for the most part, it doesn't. Instead, it becomes an extension of the experience, at times refined, at times overtly stylized, occasionally memorable, but always contributing to the film's progression. For a story defined by velocity, pressure, and constant escalation, speed depends on something equally essential: connection. Without human interaction, without relationships shaping the response to danger, the experience would risk becoming purely procedural, a sequence of events rather than a lived tension. Instead, the film builds its intensity through evolving character dynamics. It begins with partnership. Jack Traven and Harry Temple operate with precision, measured, synchronized, and grounded in mutual trust. There is an unspoken history between them, a sense of familiarity that stabilizes the opening sequence. When the situation escalates, their response is not reactive chaos, but coordinated execution. Once the narrative shifts to the bus, that foundation dissolves and is replaced by something far more uncertain. Now, the focus turns to Jack Traven and Annie Porter. This is not a partnership forged through experience. There is no shared past, only immediate necessity. Two individuals forced into alignment under extreme pressure. That transition reshapes the emotional structure of the film. The tension no longer emerges solely from the external threat, but from the dynamics between them. From communication, from uncertainty, from trust developing in real time. Annie does not simply follow direction. She questions, responds, and asserts herself within the situation. And Jack, rather than maintaining rigid control, adapts, learning to work with someone who was never intended to be part of the plan. Around them, the environment introduces another layer of complexity. The passengers, though not deeply explored, serve a critical function. They introduce unpredictability. Their reactions vary: cooperation, resistance, panic, and those differences transform the bus into something more than a setting. It becomes a contained system of human variables, constantly shifting under pressure. This is where the film's dynamics find their strength. They evolve continuously, from professional coordination to improvised partnership to collective survival. Every interaction contributes to the overall tension, because in a situation where a single error can determine the outcome, survival is not just about maintaining speed. It is about whether individuals can function together long enough to sustain it. At the center of this escalating system stands one stabilizing presence: Jack Traven. And here, the film makes a defining casting decision. Keanu Reeves does not approach the role as a dominant, larger-than-life figure. There is no reliance on overt dramatics or heightened emotional display. Instead, the performance is built on restraint. In a narrative where everything else is in motion, Jack becomes a point of balance. Focused, deliberate, and reactive, he moves with clarity. He does not hesitate or overanalyze. He acts. That physical presence aligns precisely with the demands of the role. This is not a character constructed through layered psychology or extensive backstory. It is defined through action, through decisions made under pressure. Reeves delivers this through commitment rather than embellishment. The performance does not rely on expressive range. It relies on consistency. And while some may interpret that restraint as limitation, moments where the delivery feels understated compared to the intensity of the situation, it ultimately serves the character's function. Jack is not meant to unravel. He is not meant to dominate through emotion. He is the one individual within the system who must remain composed. His role is to maintain forward movement regardless of the surrounding instability. And that is precisely why the performance works. It aligns with the film's rhythm. As everything escalates, he remains grounded. As the circumstances grow increasingly improbable, he continues to treat them with complete seriousness. That contrast prevents the narrative from losing its structural balance. This role did more than fit Keanu Reeves. It defined his presence within the genre. It demonstrated that an action lead does not need to overpower the film to carry it. Sometimes, anchoring it is enough. Opposite him, the film introduces an equally important element: human warmth. And that is where Sandra Bullock as Annie Porter becomes essential. On paper, Annie could have remained a functional role, another passenger within the scenario, reacting to events without shaping them. Instead, she becomes the emotional core of the film. Untrained and unprepared, she is placed in a situation that demands immediate responsibility. What makes her compelling is not fearlessness but relatability. She hesitates, she questions, she reacts with uncertainty yet continues forward. Bullock's performance elevates the character through energy and presence. She introduces a sense of immediacy that balances the mechanical precision of the action. Her reactions feel instinctive. Her presence brings vitality to the unfolding events. Even within sustained tension, she provides the audience with a human anchor, someone who reflects the reality of being placed in such a situation. The dynamic between Annie and Jack develops rapidly, shaped not by extended dialogue, but by shared urgency. Trust is established through necessity rather than time. Their interaction carries a natural rhythm, control met with spontaneity, direction met with challenge. This contrast prevents the film from becoming tonally uniform. The character itself is not without inconsistencies. At times, Annie's portrayal shifts to meet the demands of the moment, alternating between decisiveness and reaction. For some, this variation may feel uneven, yet Bullock bridges those gaps through performance. Her timing, presence, and adaptability sustain the character's credibility. This role was not merely another appearance, it marked a defining moment. Annie is not simply part of the narrative, she shapes its emotional experience. Without that combination of vulnerability, resilience, and immediacy, the film would retain its momentum but lose much of its vitality. And then, at the center of the threat, is the figure that defines the stakes. Because in any action-driven narrative, the effectiveness of the conflict depends entirely on the presence of the antagonist. Here, that role belongs to Howard Payne, portrayed by Dennis Hopper. He is not merely an opposing force. He is a constant presence that extends across the entire narrative. He does not need to occupy the same physical space as the characters to exert control. A voice, transmitted from a distance, is enough to shape the outcome. A set of rules is all he requires. He constructs a system and then compels everyone else to operate within it. What gives him weight is how personal the conflict feels. This is not arbitrary disruption, nor an anonymous act of aggression. Howard Payne is driven by motive, frustration, resentment, and an underlying need to prove something, particularly to Jack Traven. When his initial plan is disrupted, he does not retreat. He recalibrates, he escalates, and in doing so, he transforms the situation into something far more volatile. That sense of control defines his presence. He observes from a distance, calculates constantly, and maintains authority without placing himself directly in harm's way. This dynamic protagonist immersed within the crisis, antagonist orchestrating it from afar, creates a persistent layer of tension. Dennis Hopper leans into that dynamic with striking intensity. There is an unpredictability in his delivery measured one moment, volatile the next. He does not approach the character with restraint, he embraces its instability, and that instability keeps the audience unsettled, never entirely certain of what his next move might be. At the same time, the character draws from familiar archetypes: the strategist who communicates through distance, the orchestrator who reveals just enough to sustain the game. There are moments where the portrayal leans toward theatricality. He speaks when silence might serve him better. He extends situations that could be resolved more directly, and his plan, when examined closely, depends on precision, timing, and a sequence of variables aligning in his favor. Yet within the context of speed, perfection is not the objective. Impact is, and Payne delivers that. Even when the structure shows its strain, the presence remains effective. Hopper brings enough energy, tension, and personality to elevate the role beyond its framework. He does not simply oppose the protagonist, he defines the structure of the conflict itself. In a narrative built on pressure, timing, and control, he becomes the one directing the system, even when that control appears precarious. For a film defined by constant motion and escalation, it also recognizes the importance of scale. It cannot rely solely on two central figures. Without a broader environment, the stakes would feel contained, the world diminished. So the film expands outward, building a living framework around its central conflict. Jeff Daniels, as Harry Temple, plays a vital role in grounding the narrative, particularly in its opening phase. His partnership with Jack introduces credibility, experience, composure, and a sense of familiarity with high-pressure situations. He does not dominate the narrative, but his steadiness provides a foundation that supports everything that follows. As the story transitions onto the bus, that dynamic broadens. The focus shifts from trained professionals to ordinary individuals placed under extraordinary strain. The passengers themselves become an essential component of the tension. Their responses vary: cooperation, hesitation, resistance, and those differences introduce unpredictability into every moment. The bus evolves beyond a simple setting. It becomes a contained system of human responses, each influencing the outcome. Beyond that confined space, the narrative maintains a connection to the wider world. Law enforcement coordination, external efforts to track the threat, and the presence of authority figures expand the scope. The situation no longer feels isolated. It unfolds as a larger crisis, affecting an entire city in real time. The balance is not flawless. Certain characters remain underdeveloped, and some fade into the background more quickly than they might have. There are moments where additional depth could have strengthened their impact. Yet within the structure, they fulfill a clear purpose. They amplify the stakes. They introduce complexity. They make the situation feel less controlled, more human. Because in a narrative where a single misstep can determine the outcome, it is not enough to focus solely on hero and antagonist. The individuals in between, the ones who hesitate, who react unpredictably, who depend on others, are what sustain the tension. That interplay between control and unpredictability, between expertise and inexperience, is what gives the film its energy. The bus does not simply carry passengers, it carries uncertainty. If the concept draws the audience in and the action sustains engagement, then it is the filmmaking itself that gives the film its vitality. This is not only a well-constructed script, it is a carefully directed one. Jean Debon approaches the material with a clear understanding of its demands. Despite this being his first feature as a director, the execution reflects confidence rather than hesitation. The focus is precise: maintain movement, preserve clarity, and impose control within chaos. That intention is visible throughout. The direction does not aim for subtlety. It prioritizes immediacy. The camera does not remain distant. It engages directly with the action. It tracks movement, responds to shifts, and at times feels as though it is struggling to keep pace. This creates a sense of immersion, drawing the viewer into the unfolding events. What ultimately sustains this approach is the editing. In a film driven by pace, structure is determined not only by writing, but by how each moment connects to the next. Sequences transition seamlessly, maintaining energy without interruption. Each cut serves a purpose: building tension, releasing it just enough, and then reintroducing it with renewed intensity. This creates a form of visual momentum. The audience is not observing isolated scenes. They are carried through a continuous flow of events. And despite the complexity, multiple locations, intersecting actions, shifting perspectives, the film maintains clarity. The spatial relationships remain understandable. The viewer always knows where they are, what is happening, and why it matters. That clarity is essential. Without it, action becomes noise. The film avoids that outcome by ensuring every movement has direction, every transition has intention, and every sequence contributes to the cumulative tension. There are, of course, consequences to this approach. The sustained pace, rapid transitions, and constant motion can feel overwhelming. For some, it enhances the experience. For others, it becomes demanding. But it is a deliberate choice. The film does not invite detachment. It demands involvement. This is where its visual style succeeds. It does not seek refinement or restraint. It prioritizes energy. In a narrative defined by forward momentum, stillness is never an option. If direction provides structure, the camera becomes the system that carries it forward. The film does not simply depict action, it reacts to it. Movement is constant. The frame adjusts, shifts, and follows with urgency, as though attempting to keep pace rather than observe from a distance. This creates a powerful effect: immediacy. The audience is not positioned outside the events, they are placed within them. When the bus shifts direction, the camera responds. When the situation destabilizes, the frame reflects that instability. It searches, adjusts, and reorients, mirroring the uncertainty of the moment. That is where the intensity originates, not only from the events themselves, but from the way they are presented. There is a rawness to the execution, an absence of excessive polish that enhances its impact. It does not feel carefully staged, it feels immediate. and that immediacy sustains the tension, even in moments where the action momentarily subsides. Because even in moments where nothing visibly escalates, the camera communicates a quiet warning. Something could shift at any second. That persistent sense of instability is never allowed to fade. And for some, that approach can feel overwhelming. The constant movement, the shifting perspectives, the absence of stillness, it can become disorienting, even claustrophobic. It feels as though the film denies the viewer a moment of visual rest, just as it denies the narrative a moment of pause. But this is not incidental. It is intentional design. Speed is not interested in presenting events with calm detachment. It is built to immerse you in pressure, in instability, in the urgency of a situation that exists on the edge of collapse. The camera does not simply observe tension, it participates in it, and that is why the visual intensity resonates so strongly. It is not only about what is shown, but about how persistently the film compels you to remain engaged. Beneath that visual energy, however, lies another layer that quietly sustains the experience: sound. In a film defined by motion and urgency, the sonic environment becomes just as essential as the imagery. The score does not overwhelm, it propels. It functions like an additional current running beneath the narrative, reinforcing momentum even in moments where the action momentarily steadies. As tension rises, the music responds. As pressure builds, it tightens. It ensures that the sense of urgency never fully dissipates. But the effectiveness of the soundscape extends beyond the score. It is the integration of every auditory element: the engines under strain, the friction of tires against asphalt, the distant presence of sirens, the sharp impact of collisions. Each layer contributes to a cohesive sensory experience. You do not simply observe the movement, you hear it laboring, accelerating, resisting. You do not just witness impact, you register its force. As the situation intensifies, the environment becomes increasingly saturated with sound, drawing you further into the experience. The world of the film grows louder, more immediate, more insistent. Alongside this, there is a distinct physicality to the execution. Even when the narrative extends beyond strict plausibility, the presentation maintains weight. Vehicles carry mass. Motion carries resistance. Impact carries consequence. This sense of tangibility is not accidental. It is the result of careful staging, practical execution, and precise coordination. The action does not simply appear large, it feels substantial. All of these elements converge to create immersion. When the technical craft operates at this level, the individual components dissolve into a unified experience. You are no longer conscious of editing, sound design, or musical structure. You are responding to the tension as a continuous flow. This is the film's underlying achievement. It does not merely depict danger, it surrounds the audience with it. Through sound, through motion, through impact, it sustains engagement across every sense. The tension becomes something you do not just witness, but experience. Yet for all its momentum, its precision, and its sustained intensity, there is one dimension the film rarely allows itself to explore: depth. Beneath the spectacle and urgency, the characterization remains relatively minimal. We understand these individuals through function. Jack Traven operates as the central force of action. Annie Porter becomes the unexpected counterpart within the system. Howard Payne drives the conflict from a distance. Beyond these roles, however, there is limited space for exploration. The film does not pause to examine histories or internal motivations in depth. It does not linger on emotional aftermaths or extended reflection. Everything is oriented toward the immediate, what must be done now to sustain momentum. This is a deliberate choice. The narrative prioritizes reaction over introspection. Characters are defined by their responses under pressure rather than by internal transformation. Jack is understood through decisive action. Annie is revealed through resilience. Payne is shaped through control and escalation. It is an efficient approach, but one with limitations. Traditional character evolution is largely absent. By the conclusion, the individuals have not undergone significant internal change. They have endured. For some, this aligns perfectly with the film's objective. It is not attempting to function as a character-driven study. It is designed as an experience. Within that framework, deeper exploration could disrupt the pace it depends on. For others, however, this restraint creates distance. The stakes are clear, but the emotional connection may not always reach the same intensity. The risk is immediate, but the attachment to those at risk remains more observational than deeply personal. Relationships function effectively within the structure, yet they are not extensively developed. This becomes the film's central trade-off. It sacrifices depth in favor of momentum. It exchanges complexity for clarity. It chooses immediacy over reflection. While this limits certain dimensions, it also enables the film to maintain its relentless progression. In a narrative governed by urgency, there is little space to pause and look inward. Amid that intensity, however, the film introduces a subtle counterbalance, moments of lightness. Not in excess, and not in a way that disrupts the tone, but just enough to prevent the experience from becoming overwhelming. Without these moments, the sustained pressure could become too heavy, too uniform, too exhausting. Instead, the film allows space for human reaction. Characters speak, respond, and occasionally introduce a note of levity. These are not overt comedic beats, but natural expressions, brief releases within the tension. This rhythm becomes important. Seriousness gives way to lightness, tension gives way to release, and then the pressure returns. These small variations allow the audience to reset just enough to remain engaged. The exchanges between Jack Traven and Annie Porter reflect this balance. So do the reactions of the passengers. These moments introduce humanity into the system. They remind the viewer that these are not simply components within a sequence. They are individuals responding in unpredictable ways. Fear does not always manifest as intensity. It can appear uncertain, fragmented, even awkward. Sometimes it emerges through humor, through disbelief, through tension released in unexpected forms. That human layer adds texture. It softens the edges of the spectacle and makes the stakes feel more immediate, not because they are amplified, but because they are grounded in recognizable behavior. The balance is not always seamless. There are instances where tonal shifts feel abrupt, where lightness briefly undercuts tension, or where dialogue leans toward stylization. Yet even these imperfections contribute to the film's character. They prevent it from becoming overly controlled or detached. Because ultimately, the film is not aiming for precision alone, it is aiming for vitality. The presence of humor, however subtle, ensures that the experience remains dynamic rather than mechanical. In a narrative defined by risk, motion, and continuous escalation, those brief moments of release serve a critical function. They allow the film to sustain its intensity without becoming overwhelming. And within that ongoing movement, the film makes a quiet transition. It eases, if only slightly, to introduce something more grounded connection. The connection between Jack Traven and Annie Porter does not follow a traditional trajectory. There is no gradual foundation, no carefully layered progression, no extended space for emotional development. It unfolds in the only way it can within this narrative under pressure. They meet in crisis. They communicate through urgency. Every exchange is shaped by the immediate need to survive. Jack directs. Annie responds. He stabilizes. She questions. And within that continuous exchange between risk and decision, something begins to take form. It is not intricate or deeply explored, but it is immediate. And that immediacy gives it a certain credibility within the moment. Because in a situation where outcomes can shift instantly, emotions accelerate. Trust forms rapidly. Connections intensify beyond what would normally be expected. The film does not challenge this idea, it relies on it. Their dynamic carries much of the emotional weight. There is a natural energy in their interaction that sustains the relationship, even if it is not structurally developed in depth. They balance each other in motion. Jack remains composed and focused, while Annie introduces unpredictability and emotional response. That contrast creates movement, not only within the action, but within their connection. At the same time, this is where the film reveals its limitations. The relationship evolves quickly and reaches a resolution that feels more like a conclusion than a fully realized progression. For some, this adds a layer of warmth to the narrative. For others, it can feel compressed, even somewhat expected. There is a sense that its inclusion aligns with convention, an emotional anchor placed within a high-stakes structure. Still, it serves a clear purpose. It humanizes the experience. It softens the sustained intensity and provides something beyond survival for the audience to engage with. Even without extensive development, it introduces a sense of connection that makes the unfolding events feel more personal. Without it, speed would exist purely as momentum and mechanics. With it, there is at least a suggestion of something more, a brief but effective emotional thread woven into the chaos. At its core, the film presents an unspoken question: should it prioritize precision or engagement? It does not attempt to balance both equally. From the moment its premise takes hold, it makes a decisive choice. It does not slow to justify every element. It does not pause to explain each decision in detail. It does not aim for a layered, analytically driven structure. Instead, it commits fully to experience, direct, immediate, and unfiltered. This choice defines the entire film. It moves too quickly to invite extended analysis. It constructs sequences rather than arguments. It builds tension through motion rather than logic. Each moment is designed to sustain attention, not to invite scrutiny. For many, this is precisely why it succeeds. There are times when the purpose of cinema is not to be examined, but to be felt, to create a sense of immediacy so strong that analysis becomes secondary. The focus shifts from plausibility to anticipation. The question is no longer whether something is realistic, but whether the next moment can be navigated. Yet this approach naturally divides perspective. Not all viewers are willing to accept that exchange. For some, the lack of structural precision becomes noticeable, even disruptive. Moments that stretch plausibility, decisions that rely on convenience, scenarios that do not withstand close examination, these elements can interrupt immersion rather than enhance it. And when that happens, the experience shifts. What was once engaging can begin to feel overstated. The balance between spectacle and coherence becomes more apparent. The film reveals both its strengths and its compromises. This is the central tension within Speed. It operates with complete awareness of its identity, yet that identity does not resonate equally with every viewer. On one side, it stands as a precise example of sustained momentum, an experience designed for engagement above all else. On the other, it can be seen as prioritizing impact over depth, immediacy over structure, and yet it remains effective. Because it recognizes a fundamental aspect of the medium, engagement does not always depend on complexity. Often, it emerges from intensity. The film does not invite analysis. It invites participation. It does not ask to be examined. It asks to be experienced. Beneath that experience lies another defining influence: the conventions of its genre. The language of action cinema, particularly in its era, carries a distinct framework. A central male figure navigating a destabilized system, a crisis that demands individual control, a structure that places responsibility on decisive action. Jack Traven embodies that framework. He is direct, physical, and consistently forward-moving. He does not hesitate or overanalyze, he responds. The narrative aligns itself with that principle, reinforcing the idea that in moments of extreme risk, control belongs to the individual willing to act. However, the film introduces a subtle variation through Annie Porter. She is not confined to passive observation. She is placed directly within the center of the action, required to assume responsibility under circumstances she was never prepared for. She becomes essential, not by design, but by necessity. This creates an interesting dynamic. On one level, Annie challenges traditional expectations. She makes decisions, asserts herself, and directly influences the outcome. On another level, the overarching structure remains unchanged. Jack continues to guide the situation. The narrative still orbits his perspective. Annie operates within that framework rather than redefining it entirely. That duality introduces a layer of tension. Her role exists between positions, both active and reactive, both independent and guided. At times, she feels central to the narrative's progression. At others, the structure reasserts itself, shaping her role according to the demands of the moment. This reflects a broader transition within the genre itself. The framework was beginning to shift, allowing for greater agency, but had not yet fully evolved. Annie occupies that transitional space, not defined by a single role, but by the movement between them. And within that space, her presence remains significant. She demonstrates that survival is not solely determined by strength or control, but by adaptability, the ability to assume responsibility in unexpected circumstances and sustain it. From the outset, the film establishes a tone rooted in immediate risk. Before the central premise fully unfolds, there is a clear understanding: this environment is not stable. The stakes are not abstract, they are immediate and physical. The intensity does not rely on excess. It is not defined by constant graphic imagery, but by impact. Events occur quickly, with consequence. When something shifts, it alters the situation entirely. A single action can redefine the stakes. A miscalculation carries immediate results. This is how the film sustains its tension. It does not rely solely on scale. It relies on consequence. Every moment reinforces the underlying reality that the situation is fragile and that any deviation can alter its outcome. It does not depend solely on scale. It draws its strength from the constant possibility of loss. Every shift in direction, every disruption, every plan that falters carries the suggestion that the outcome could change instantly, that stability is always temporary. Control exists, but only briefly and never completely. That sense of unpredictability sustains the tension. The film does not fully insulate its characters from consequence. It allows moments where the illusion of safety fractures, where the situation reveals its underlying severity, even if only for an instant. Those moments are essential. They reinforce that this is not simply a controlled sequence of events. It is a fragile scenario where miscalculation has real impact. At the same time, the film maintains balance. It does not dwell excessively on harshness, nor does it rely on intensity for its own sake. Instead, it uses it with precision to sustain engagement while preserving the broader tone. The result is a controlled form of intensity, focused and purposeful, always rooted in the situation itself. That is why it remains effective. It does not overwhelm with constant escalation, but it never allows the underlying sense of threat to disappear. The danger is not continuous chaos, it is continuous possibility. And in a narrative defined by the need to maintain momentum, that ever-present risk prevents the experience from ever feeling secure. By the time speed approaches its peak, it carries the sense of a natural conclusion. The central concept has been fully realized. The tension has been extended to its limits. The core idea, the single rule that defines everything, has delivered its full impact. For a moment, it feels complete. But the film continues. It advances beyond that point, introducing another phase, another environment, another variation of the same underlying tension. For some, this extension feels like a final surge, one more escalation to sustain the experience through to its conclusion. The momentum remains intact, the stakes persist, and the urgency does not diminish. For others, the effect is different. It can feel less like escalation and more like prolongation. The bus sequence represents the film at its most concentrated, its concept at its clearest, its tension at its most focused. Once that sequence concludes, anything that follows inevitably invites comparison. The structure risks repetition, revisiting the same core idea in a new form. This creates a divide in interpretation. Some appreciate the refusal to decelerate, the commitment to maintaining intensity until the final moment. Others perceive it as an overextension, where the narrative stretches beyond its most effective point. At the center of this response lies the film's defining principle, momentum. The entire structure is designed to sustain movement, to escalate continuously, to avoid stillness. But momentum also requires direction. It benefits from resolution. When forward motion continues without clear closure, it can diminish the precision that initially defined it. Even so, the final act remains consistent with the film's philosophy. It does not reduce intensity, it amplifies it. More movement, more risk, more urgency. No pause, no restraint. Whether that final extension feels like a satisfying continuation or an unnecessary addition depends entirely on how one responds to the film's central approach. To fully understand its impact, it is important to consider its position within the broader action landscape. This film emerges from an established framework, one that had already proven effective. A confined environment, innocent individuals placed at risk, a controlling antagonist, a central figure attempting to prevent collapse. This structure was not new. It had been refined and recognized. What speed does is reinterpret it. The comparison often drawn, die hard within a moving vehicle, captures the essence of that transformation. The concept remains familiar, but the environment shifts. A stationary setting provides control. A moving one removes it. A bus introduces variables that cannot be contained: traffic, obstacles, external conditions. The environment itself becomes an active force within the conflict. Movement is no longer just part of the story. It becomes the defining mechanism. This is where the film establishes its identity. It does not abandon established conventions. It adapts them. It introduces instability into a structure that traditionally relies on containment. It replaces control with constant motion. At the same time, it remains firmly aligned with the conventions of its era. Clear stakes, a defined protagonist, a memorable antagonist, and a structure built on escalation. It does not attempt to redefine the genre entirely. It seeks to execute it with precision and intensity, and in doing so, it distinguishes itself. Where some action films rely primarily on scale or spectacle, this one depends on sustained pressure. It transforms a familiar formula by introducing continuous movement and removing the safety of stillness. That balance between familiarity and adaptation is what allows it to stand apart. It remains connected to the lineage of the genre while establishing a distinct identity within it. In a landscape often defined by repetition, that distinction becomes significant. When the film was released in 1994, it did not arrive with the expectation of redefining the genre. Its premise appeared straightforward, its structure recognizable, yet its reception told a different story. It achieved widespread success, transforming a focused concept into a global phenomenon. More importantly, it created lasting impact beyond its immediate performance. It reshaped the trajectory of those involved. Keanu Reeves transitioned into a definitive action presence, an identity that would extend far beyond this single role. Sandra Bullock emerged with a level of recognition that redefined her career, her performance resonating through a combination of presence, accessibility, and energy. Behind the camera, Jan de Bont demonstrated a command of the genre that established confidence in his approach. The film reinforced the idea that effective action requires not only scale, but control, rhythm, and a clear understanding of movement. The central concept itself achieved lasting recognition. A simple rule governing a moving thread, immediate, adaptable, and widely understood. It became part of the cultural vocabulary, referenced, reinterpreted, and remembered long after its initial release. Over time, many films within the genre fade as new ones emerge, yet this one remains present. It continues to be revisited, discussed, and recognized as a defining example of its era, not because it is without flaws, but because it fulfills its purpose with clarity. Its legacy is not rooted in transformation, but in execution. It understood its objective, committed to it fully, and delivered with precision. And in doing so, it secured a place that extends beyond its moment. Which leads to a final consideration: what distinguishes a film that simply works from one that endures? What ultimately separates a film that simply works from one that endures is not how it feels the first time, it's whether it invites you back. And Speed is one of those rare experiences that continues to draw viewers in, years, even decades after its release. What makes that return so compelling is that the experience evolves. The first viewing is driven by immediacy. It is pure momentum, intense, unpredictable, and overwhelming in its forward motion. You are carried through it, responding instinctively to each moment as it unfolds. On revisiting it, however, the perspective shifts. The structure becomes more visible. The implausibilities stand out more clearly. Certain elements, the dialogue, the mechanics, the logic, invite closer examination. The film reveals its edges, and yet the engagement remains. Because even as those imperfections become more apparent, the core remains intact. The tension still functions. The pacing still sustains momentum. The central idea still anchors the entire experience. The film does not rely on surprise. It relies on execution. You know the progression, you anticipate the major moments, but the way they unfold continues to hold attention. This is what gives it lasting rewatch value. It is not dependent on discovery, but on design. That enduring quality also extends across generations. The film is not confined to the audience that first experienced it in the 1990s. New viewers can approach it without context and still find themselves engaged. The premise is direct, the stakes are immediate, and the structure is universally accessible. At the same time, those who return to it bring a different perspective. Memory shapes the experience. It becomes more than a film. It becomes a reflection of a particular moment within the genre. What once felt groundbreaking may now feel heightened or stylized, yet that very quality can add to its appeal. It gains a layer of familiarity, even a certain charm. In some cases, the relationship with the film evolves over time. What once felt definitive may later be questioned, only to be rediscovered again from a different vantage point. That kind of cyclical engagement is uncommon, Many films diminish as they age. This one transforms but does not disappear. It becomes multiple things depending on the viewer: an intense experience, a flawed but effective work, a recognizable piece of genre history, at times even something more playful in tone. Yet through all of those interpretations, it remains watchable, and that is the defining measure. No matter how the landscape of cinema evolves, no matter how scale and spectacle continue to expand, if a film can still draw you back in, if it can still hold your attention, then it has not faded, it has endured. At the same time, the film's reception has always reflected a distinct divide. Few works generate such contrasting responses from the same material. For some, it represents a precise example of action filmmaking at its most effective: focused, immediate, and consistently engaging. It delivers exactly what it promises, without hesitation. For others, those same qualities reveal limitations: the structural shortcuts, the heightened scenarios, the absence of deeper characterization. These elements become more pronounced, making the experience feel less cohesive. Where one viewer sees intensity, another sees excess. Where one experiences immersion, another recognizes repetition. This contrast defines its reception. The film does not operate in a neutral space. It requires a level of acceptance from its audience, a willingness to engage with its rules and priorities. If that acceptance is given, the experience remains compelling. If it is withheld, the construction becomes more apparent and the illusion weakens. This duality is part of what sustains its relevance. The conversation around it has not settled. It continues to invite differing interpretations, prompting ongoing discussion about its strengths, its compromises, and the reasons it resonates or doesn't. In that sense, the division itself becomes part of its identity. A film that generates such distinct reactions leaves a lasting impression. Its success, of course, led to the expectation of continuation. The elements were all in place: a recognizable concept, strong reception, emerging stars, and a clear identity. Extending it seemed inevitable, yet the challenge was inherent from the beginning. The effectiveness of Speed is rooted in its central idea: a single rule governing a moving situation. That rule is not just a detail, it is the structure that supports everything. When that core is altered, the foundation shifts. This is where the sequel, Speed 2: Cruise Control, encounters difficulty. While it retains elements of scale and spectacle, it moves away from the precise constraint that defined the original. The concept expands, but the clarity diminishes. The urgency softens. The structure becomes less focused. The difference is not simply one of execution, it is one of design. The original is tightly constructed, with every element reinforcing a single condition. Remove that condition, and the system changes entirely. As a result, the comparison between the two highlights what made the first film so effective. It demonstrates how much of its success depended on balance, clarity of premise, control of pacing, and the alignment of every component toward a unified idea. Without that balance, the experience shifts. This is why the sequel is often viewed differently, not because it lacks ambition, but because it lacks the defining constraint that gave the original its identity. It illustrates how difficult it is to replicate that level of precision. And in doing so, it reinforces the strength of the original. Its effectiveness was not incidental. It was the result of a carefully constructed system, one that is far more difficult to reproduce than it initially appears. Sometimes, the clearest way to understand the impact of a film is to see what happens when its core is removed. And in this case, that contrast reveals just how essential that core truly was.